Hi guys, and welcome back to Manch Talk. I'm your host, Carla, and it is another wonderful spring Wednesday, and I'm excited to be here with you guys to let you know sort of what happened with Liberty Forum, which of course is one of the signature Free State Project events that is hosted here in the great Granite State. I also wanted to touch base a little bit on top stories in the news this week, and then talk a little bit about this DEI scandal that kind of blew up in Manchester schools here in Manchester. And you know, it's sort of interesting. I think I've figured out a new way to look at perhaps some of these challenges that we are facing as the world kind of both centralizes under legal control and as we decentralize as individuals down to the smallest unit. So I actually think there's a real tension, and maybe the law, as we know and understand it, hasn't really kept up with where society or even consciousness is heading. But first, before we get all woo with all of you, let's see what's in the news this week. So one of the things I noticed, just in case you missed it, all the unions in New Hampshire are getting cost of living increases. It's about 3%, which when you consider what the inflation rate is probably reasonable. I wanted to remind everyone, actually, that that it's tick season, which of course here in New Hampshire means it's possibly Lyme season. So since I've been pulling the ticks left, right, and center off the dog and actually off my husband, you know, if you are out there, if you're either gardening, which most of us are out there doing at this stage, or out hiking in the beautiful nature that we have here, please do be aware. And in case you didn't know this, if you get bit by a tick and you find it, actually see if you can get it off, right? And you want to be going in the direction of the tick head. And actually there's a little device that was made by someone who's from New Hampshire. It's called a tick scoop, and you can find them anywhere. It's basically just a little cup, like a little scoop with a V in the front, and so you can scoop the tick. But you can save your tick, throw it in a Ziploc bag and mail it off. I believe it's like $25, and they can actually test the tick so that you don't have to worry, did I get Lyme? And also so that you don't have to actually take the antibiotics unless you have it, right? So you don't want to preemptively be taking too many antibiotics, because that messes up your biome, and then from your biome it knocks on to all the other parts of your health. So what was Liberty Forum like? So Liberty Forum just took place this past weekend at the Grapponi Center in Concord. I think it was a smashing success, and a shout out to the entire team. Of course, at the Free State Project, we have a couple of or three staff members, paid employees, but most of these events and most of the organization runs on people power. So it's always great to see what the vibe is at an event. Is the team gelling? Are people working well together? Is there a happy vibe? And to me, at least, it felt very much like that was the case this year. Everything from my perspective went very smoothly. It may have been that I finally am at the stage where I can wear uncomfortable shoes and just do the things I need to do. But, I had some wrap-up conversations. We're going to have a big wrap-up volunteer party next week. But a few of the things I thought were highlights. I really enjoyed the Soho debate that took place between our executive director, Eric Brakey, who of course is a 3-term former Maine senator, state senator, and a gentleman called Andrew Heaton, who's a really funny guy, actually, and he does a lot of content now for Reason magazine and is the author of a book on tribalism. So their debate was kind of like, should we be expending more energy at the Hellmouth in DC, or should we be pursuing projects like the Free State Project, which of course is basically localism on steroids. I tried to explain that localism on steroids conversation or idea to a journalist who showed up from, I think it was In-Depth, New Hampshire, and he came for both the days, and I thought that was interesting, and I'll tell another story about a documentary film crew as well. So to me, who does a lot of work with the media, and of course, I'm kind of an independent reporter at this stage, it's always interesting to me to see what the questions are, what people are curious about. And so when the In-Depth New Hampshire guy was asking me questions, I felt like he was so far removed. I don't know if he had come with a very clear thought of what it was going to be. You know, there was word on the street was that Granite State Progress or some progressive left people were going to show up and protest. I'm not really sure what exactly they're protesting. To me, it is very bizarre that people are anti-individualism. That's literally being anti-human. So I don't really personally get it. But, you know, when I was talking to this reporter, he asked me, like, what was I excited about? What are the big issues that Free Staters are caught up in right now? And, you know, and my answer, as it always is well, it depends. You got to ask different people what their take is, right? Because we want this monolithic brand called Free Staters, but Free Staters are a group of individuals. So you got to ask them each what they think. So I said I was excited about Maha, and he goes, what's that? And I go, you know, Bobby. And he's like, Bobby who? And I'm like, RFK, you know, the guy who kind of came from your side of things. And so I explained what Make America Healthy Again is. And I could see the wheels turning where he was like, oh, I wanted this to be a weird alt-right, I don't even know what those words mean either, gathering, and yet here it is, just interesting people having interesting conversations. Speaking about interesting conversations, actually something that was introduced this year that I think we will bring back was the dialogue series. I hosted one of those. I don't think I actually followed the format. I might not even have registered there was a format, but I kind of did one about how we can incorporate a little more feelings into how we're dealing with people, right? It's great to have high IQ and have the best arguments and know you're right and, you know, have run it through the AI and be like, yes, I am right, because if then this, you know, so the logic and the rationality is all there. But if you're over here and you actually have the best idea, but you're so bad at communicating it that no one over here wants to adopt it, that is a problem. And so I really want to help people start to bridge that gap where between IQ and EQ, or, you know, emotional intelligence, or just dealing better so that we can be better advocates for liberty, for individual liberty, right? So that kind of brings me to the DEI stuff a little bit. Actually, one more thought on Liberty Forum. The other people who were there, who I'm not quite sure who they are, at one stage I was like, you know, or this could just be, I mean, it was a film crew from LA. They claim they're documentary filmmakers that are very curious about the Free State Project. They kind of want to do a show, you know, where they can get different characters and kind of follow different angles. But they said their impetus for making this movie, or even exploring the ideas of anti-statism, was because of the fires in LA specifically, and COVID. Of course, California had a really bad COVID response, right? It was a very lockdown state. It was very paranoid. It was very fear-driven. It was very mania-driven. And by which I mean, you know, the response was not supported by the actual facts on the ground. Whether you want to acknowledge that for yourself or not, that is the reality. And so they were asking me questions that I thought were interesting too. Like one of them, or one direction, was sort of like, why are libertarians so conspiratorial? And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Is that a fair assessment? And then I was like, yeah, it probably is true. I don't know all libertarians, but many of us. And so I was like, well, I think it's because we're naturally curious people, and that we like to read and we're inquisitive. And if you like to read and you're inquisitive, you're probably going to keep reading when you're being given information and it's either not answering the question in your mind to your satisfaction, or you hear one part of a response and then it gives you all these knock-on other questions to ask. And so are we uniquely conspiratorial, or are we just uniquely more curious and therefore better informed because we're doing a lot of wide reading? There are other questions where, they're still asking about the Bears and Grafton folks. So I'm going to have to actually write a book about Bears and Grafton one day to just be like, zap this, here's the counter argument. All right, so some of the top stories in New Hampshire this week are, obviously there are some political tensions and it's budget time, so there are a lot of budget fights going on. I was talking to several state reps over the weekend. It was very interesting to see how nuanced each person's little take was, because they're coming from different committees. So one guy's transport, and he's like, you won't believe these freight trains, they want like a $2 million handout just because they've always had it, right? And this other state rep's like, oh, we're having a real problem with this vaccine registry thing. Or, for me with Right to Know, people are like, oh, looks like they're gonna cut the ombudsman or put it in under this other office, and then like slowly dial it down. So there's a lot of stuff going on currently with the budget. It's interesting, they have made up, I believe it was Kelly Ayotte, the governor's actual budget, right? So the governor writes a budget, the House writes a budget, the Senate writes a budget, and then they try and smoosh it together and like make it make sense. So the governor is facing criticism about Medicaid cuts, and there was some protests up at the State House about that. Sadly, there was a tragic accident at Governor's Island. A 15-year-old boy, his kayak capsized and he drowned. So the note here says, this tragedy has drawn attention to water safety as spring activities ramp up. So this is my opportunity to remind you, accidents do happen and we cannot mitigate things from happening. So this safetyism, this coddling, this every time something bad happens, we try and put people in another layer of bubble wrap with another life vest, with a floaty on a floaty on a floaty. It's not going to work. We have to change our mindset. All right, so DEI, what happened? All right, so the scandal is the following. So last week, so currently in New Hampshire, there shouldn't be any DEI training taking place. There shouldn't be any critical race theory work taking place. Parents are supposed to be informed if there's any kind of survey that's asking children to express things about themselves, so that the parent, as the parent, can be the gatekeeper as to, do I want my child to answer this or do I not? So I guess there was a teacher who added a microaggression survey to a class on the Holocaust, although nothing in the survey had anything to do with the Holocaust. It all had to do with making groups of people mad at each other, resentful of each other, and it goes both ways. So here's the interesting thing, and here's kind of my take on it, is I think where the work needs to lie on these issues is actually within the legal system. So I was doing like one of my early morning deep dives with the AI, and again, I save all those conversations because I think it's important to see both the questions, the responses, also to see how the responses might change over time. So maybe it'll be a capsule in history on my website, carlagerrick.com, with these conversations with, the different AIs. This one was specifically on Grok. But as we were having a discussion today on the DEI stuff, and if this is a topic you're interested in, please do go look at that. It's interesting to read sort of the different things and to have it really broken down very concisely, because I think one of the magic tricks that has been done with this DEI stuff is everyone is so uncomfortable to talk about it because no one knows who's offending whom. What am I allowed to say? Can I say this word but not this word? Can I do this but not this, right? And most of it is sort of steeped in stories of racism and race and power structures and all this stuff, right? So everyone immediately becomes extremely uncomfortable, and then they decide not to talk about it. Now, I actually have a theory that that is exactly what they did with conversations about the weather like 40 years ago. Some genius idiot was like, oh, you know what neighbors like to talk about? The weather. Everyone's got an opinion. It changes every 5 minutes. It's a really easy, simple, low-stakes way to interact with people in your life. And so somehow climate got politicized. But so too now, of course, has any relationships between people. And what makes me suspicious about it is actually that by its very nature, it has both a chilling effect, but it also is in the realm of feelings, but we're putting all these kind of like legal things on top of it. So when I was reading this morning about like what are microaggressions, and I have such a clear memory of talking to a really sweet college, maybe she had just graduated from college, individual, and she was telling me about a perceived microaggression where someone asked her something nice, and because they asked her something nice, that was a microaggression. And as it was explained to me in that moment, I was like, this is friggin' nuts, right? So we are teaching people to get mad about things that they probably wouldn't have gotten mad about to start with. So here's an example. Apparently asking someone where they're from is a microaggression. Now, the flip side of that as an immigrant is, oh, this is nice. Someone's showing an interest in where I'm from, and I get to talk about my home country. I get to inform an American who is, I'm sorry, I'm going to say it, generally always grossly uninformed. I don't know what you guys are reading, but it really isn't how to be a well-rounded human who understands the rest of the world. And so I was like, what? Now asking someone where they're from is a microaggression? That seems a bit much, right? And then as you dive into this world, you start to see it is a literal divide and conquer tactic to make people judge each other by all the things that we decided hundreds of years ago we weren't going to do. And so they created this like microaggression wheel, and now you're supposed to circle how terrible and bad you are, and then I suppose go home and put on a hair shirt and, I don't know, self-flagellate yourself. Or maybe we can do better and come up with some better approaches to these problems. So I want to talk about the evolution of harm in the US system. So what do I mean by that? So what I've realized is all this DEI stuff has made some kind of jump from what we can see that is tangible harm, right? So harm used to be physical harm. I'm bruised, I'm cut, someone beat me up, someone stabbed me. There was some kind of physical harm, right? And so the early common law, so I'm talking back in the 18th and 19th century, you had physical direct harm. So it was bodily injury or harm to property, right? Someone homesteaded your property or someone stole your cow or whatever, right? And so in English common law, that was rooted in financial loss, and it was your legal remedies were trying to fix the harm, right? So you would reparations, I would say, or paying back the thing, or I don't know, slapping the other guy with a glove too. I'm kidding, right? So in early common law, basically, we prioritized objective, visible harm reflecting, and I'm quoting here, but a rugged agrarian society where physical threats were paramount. Now, of course, that makes sense because the world back then was like, I don't know, slightly more dangerous. But now here is where the shift starts to happen, right? And so my supposition is, do we need consciousness courts, or do we need feeling courts? Because I think what has happened is we have moved beyond sort of the bodily harm to these perceptions of, oh, you said something mean to me on the internet and now I'm deeply harmed, or I have an internet stalker and now I'm afraid. Excuse me. But that fear is actually manifested in your mind. So it's actually self-generated. And so I think when we expanded the idea of physical harm to mental or emotional harm, we didn't adjust the legal system correctly. We haven't expanded the courts to actually have psychology as the element. And so perhaps, and you heard it here first, the hack to life is we should stop legislating anything. We should create more individualized private courts. People should write their own human constitutions. I'm writing a book on this, by the way. You should register your personal individual constitution on the blockchain, and you should start to have individualized relationships with other humans, and then say, hey, when we're butthurt or we're angry at each other or this happened, this is who we choose as our mediator, or this is how we're going to do this. But in the olden days, people were told, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. And what microaggressions are teaching people is words will always hurt you. You are a victim. You will, it's a terrible philosophy. You're literally making people, You're literally judging people by race and all the things that we had already said we don't want to do. So in the late 18th and 19th century, we expanded the definitions of emotional harm. So the courts actually started to recognize emotional harm. This was primarily not on the criminal side, but on the tort side, on the civil side, right? So, so they claim this is kind of as psychological understanding grew. People started to say that there could be an intentional infliction of emotional distress, and this became a cause of action, right? So then in the mid-20th century, what we had, of course, was the civil rights movement, and then this idea of discriminatory harm. So the jump that happened here was it wasn't individualized, right? So if you're a racist and you say something racist to someone, something should happen to you, right? If that person takes offense, or like if there's a harm, right? But that's person to person. But the magic trick they managed to do is they started to say it's systematic, right? So now no one is to blame, but the system is to blame. And that somehow now makes groups of people responsible for things they didn't do, but they're getting blamed for it, right? And that is questionable as well. So in the civil rights era, harm was expanded to include discrimination-based injuries, So it became like non-physical harm that had to do with your exclusion or something to do with your dignity. And then from the 70s on, we see in the 70s and 80s, now we start to see the HR departments coming up and this corporatism where they're starting to introduce these same sort of concepts in a private sector setting. So then the 1990s to the 2000s, you start to see the development of this notion of hate speech, which literally does not exist under the US Constitution. We have free speech. There is no such thing as hate speech. There are limited restrictions on free speech, but free speech in America is pretty broad, right? So now we have this shift where we start to say hate speech and verbal harassment are harmful, so now we have to balance it against the First Amendment, and you start to see schools and workplaces adopt speech codes. Great. Now in 2010 and onwards, we get to this level of microaggressions and systemic harm, and it becomes bananas. It is actually paradoxical what has happened, because I believe, much like Martin Luther King, right, that the content of your character should determine how you navigate and are perceived in life, right? Like you as a person, not all these other things that society plus the system, who are they? Those are the two sides of the same coin, are telling you how to feel about things. And if you're navigating life by being offended by everything, then maybe it's you, but honestly, maybe it is your literal training. And maybe we should, as we have been, start to look at what is happening in these indoctrination camps we currently call public schools. Because if we're teaching people to be divided, to look for the differences, to be mad at other people who literally did nothing to you, but someone else told you to be mad at them because paper says power, then let's stop that. I mean, my earnest plea, I suppose, here is we have to stop the idiotocracy. And if you're in a situation where you're just like, I'm embarrassed, I'm not sure, I don't understand what's going on, that is actually a tell that something rotten is going on. If you're so confused about what you're allowed to say, that's not an accident. That is someone who is trying to make you confused or to chill your speech. Our mission in life should be to be decent humans who are decent humans to other humans. And genuinely, it's not that hard. You know who makes it hard? The state. All right, I got a couple of minutes left over here, so what do you guys need to know for next week? There are upcoming events. The first one is this Saturday at the Collegians in Weare is the Pine Tree Riot. That is from noon to 3 p.m. If you Google AFP New Hampshire Pine Tree Riot, you will find a link to RSVP. Please do RSVP if you are going to go so that they know how many people are coming. It is not a dog-friendly event. Ask me how I know. Also coming up, of course, is PorkFest in about 6 weeks. Tickets are available for that, porkfest.com. And then there's always something cooking in the Free State. If you're a libertarian, you can consult fsp.org/calendar. And the two books I brought today have to do with creativity. Why is creativity important? Because from creativity comes joy, because you're making things that matter to you, even if it's a stick drawing or planting a plant and seeing the tulip the next year. But also, the more creative you are, the more you are expending your life force on the things that you like, and the more curious you become. And if you're more curious, then it is much, much harder to mind control you. And that is what I'm trying to persuade you of. Your brain is your biggest asset, and you should know at all times who's making you think what. All right, I'll leave you guys on that note. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you back here again next week.